It's often said that small towns carry big secrets, and this little town in Oregon is no different. As a folklore author begins to dig deeper and deeper into the mystery, he realizes it may go deeper than anyone ever suspected, and it may all end in murder.
What's that? You want to be scared? Come with me. You will experience tales of horror, ghosts, and death. It is not recommended for the weak at heart. Listen in the dark. It's more fun that way. This is Weekly Spooky.
Hello, my spookies. It's Wednesday. Unlike last week when we accidentally published the show a day early, but hey, that's just a bonus for all of you. But now it's time for some spooky in your weekly. I'm your host and narrator Enrique Couto, and tonight's story takes us in the territory of small-town folklore, legends, and mysteries. And we'll get to all that in just a moment, but first I want to say a big thank you to everybody who's been tuning in and leaving us 5-star ratings on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. It really does make a huge difference, as it helps bring new spookies into the fold by letting them know you're in the right place. So if you haven't left us a 5-star rating, well, it costs you nothing, and I sure would appreciate it. But if you want to support us in an even more direct way, you can head over to WeeklySpooky.com and click on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you guarantee the spooky comes every single week and beyond, and you get 2 bonus shows every single month. And right now, the bonus show is a series, a 24-part novella from Rob Fields, the man behind Strickfield. It's called The April Fool, and I know you'll get a real kick out of it if you check it out. In the town of Strickfield, for the last 4 April Fool's days, someone has been murdered. Now, things are getting a little bit more close to home as they start to affect our main character, Ashley Gable. If you want to find out more, head to WeeklySpooky.com and click on Patreon. I assure you, it is a series to die for. And of course, you'll have access to our prior series, The Weekend, and a whole bunch of other bonus shows, over 20 of them. Just go to WeeklySpooky.com and click on Patreon. But now, it's time to get to the story, my friends, so get comfortable. We'll get to that right after these quick words. Fool's Hill by Bruce Haney. From a Missing in Oregon subforum of the Lost But Never Forgotten forum. Subject line: I solved my uncle's disappearance. Hey guys, long-time reader, first-time posting. I'm not an internet sleuth per se, but I did solve my uncle's disappearance. My name is Brenda, and my uncle was a small-time folklore author who wrote under the name R.H. Thurston. You might have heard of him, maybe because of his writing, but most likely because he went missing some time ago. I wanted to share the last thing he wrote for a couple of reasons. One, so people understand how he went missing. It's a bit of a cautionary tale. Two, so his fans can read it. I think he had fans anyway. At the time of his disappearance, he was calling this piece Fool's Hill. I received what he had written of it in an email after he went missing. So, here it is. Afterward, I'll explain how I solved this 100-year-plus Oregon mystery. Fool's Hill by R.H. Thurston. You, my friend, are on top of Fool's Hill, heading down the wrong side. That was a phrase that an old man told me when I was only halfway through the journey that got me into my current predicament. How right he had been, and that was probably the last moment that I could have stopped and changed my course and gone back up that figurative hill back to my normal, boring life. I should start at the beginning, but where is the beginning? What was that first piece of folklore that I got obsessed with? Was it Bloody Mary? I loved how everybody had their own version of that tale. For some, you just recited Bloody Mary 3 times in the mirror, while others had the crueler version of the myth and would have you repeat, "Bloody Mary, I got your baby." When I was a boy, my older sister told me that Bloody Mary had died in a car accident while pregnant on prom night. How many legends take place on prom night anyway? I could tell you a few, but my time is limited, so let's get into this. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Randy. I'm a writer of folklore. The name Randy doesn't give quite the impression one wants from a history book, so I publish under the name R.H. Thurston. I've spent years researching local legends. My first book was Haunted Cemeteries of the Pacific Northwest. I followed that up with ghosts and other spooky things in Portland, Oregon. My publisher is big on having a town name or region in the title. It was during the first book that I found that newspaper article in the digital archives that started me on this journey. It wasn't really a ghost story, so I added it to my bookmarks and didn't think much about it for a couple of years. That was until my second book was published and I found myself trying to find something new to write about. I still wanted it to be about the supernatural because that's where my interests are, but I felt like I needed to do something different than another book about ghosts. The original article was short, only a few lines in the community section of a 1919 issue of the Beaver Creek Herald. It read, "William Ivanhoe of Locust Grove, Oregon, must have got himself into a bad batch of moonshine. He claims that he saw a group of witches in the woods near here. Poor old fool, this isn't Salem, Massachusetts. This is Oregon." When I did a search for William Ivanhoe, I only found a couple of references in the papers. One was a brief mention. William Ivanhoe upset claims someone is stealing all of his crops. The last mention in the papers was from 1920. W.M. Ivanhoe, of here, found in woods, dead, missing right arm. Possible bobcat attack. For a while after this, I was at a dead end in my investigation. Where could I go from here? The man had been dead for 100+ years and I couldn't find much else. I found a little more life in the search when I got rid of his name and just searched the 2 keywords, witches and Locust Grove. Not a ton of hits, just 2. That original article and one more. Cattle farmer found strange carvings in trees near Locust Grove while clearing land for his cows to roam. Is this a sign of witches? Either way, more land equals more cows and hopefully a cut in price the next time you are buying meat at Moore End Meat Market. This article was from 1926, a few years after Ivanhoe had died. So it's another local that experienced whatever it was. Through my research skills, I was able to find out where the Ivanhoe property was, where the Moran Meat Market had been, as well as where Moran's farm had been located, so I made plans to take a trip out to investigate all 3. Where Moran Meat Market used to be is now the Locust Grove Saloon. From the one photo I was able to find of the market, I believe it's still the original building. That's the great thing about those turn-of-the-century brick buildings. They never burn down and they never rot, so small towns use them forever. When I arrived, I asked a couple of locals if they had ever heard of any legends of witches in the area. The 2 I asked hadn't and didn't seem to care for my presence. Though I didn't feel welcome, I did decide to stick around long enough to have a beer and a club sandwich. Bar tip: always get the club sandwich. No matter how much of a dive you're at, and this was a dive, they don't seem to mess up on a club sandwich. How could they? Sometimes you get too much mayo, but is that all that bad? The club sandwich was excellent. The fries could have been better if they had changed their fry oil in the last decade or so. Word must have gotten around to the other daytime drinkers in the bar about my questions. An older man who looked and smelled like he'd been drinking since the night before sat next to me and said, "Buy me a shot and a beer and I'll tell you everything I know." Writing local history books is not the cash cow some might think it is. A beer and a shot are a hefty investment. I needed to consider this expense carefully. The gas getting out here and the club sandwich was more than I should have spent on this story already. "They aren't witches," he said, and then smiled at me. I could smell the cheap beer and the even cheaper whiskey on his breath. I decided I would go for it. I asked him what he drinks, and it was cheap, so I spent the money. I decided that if it was juicy information, I would buy him a good shot as well. He drank the shot as soon as the bartender set it down, then started sipping on the beer. I gave him a look to say, "Hey, you got what you wanted now, make with the details." He understood my nonverbal cue, and I took out my notebook. "What's your name?" "Bob Smith," he said, and then laughed. I wrote down the presumed alias anyway. "It's just people." I looked at him confused. "Okay, got it. Nothing supernatural?" I asked, trying not to sound too disappointed. "I wouldn't say that exactly," he said. "What would you say then?" I asked. "Let me tell you," he said. "Are they still around?" I asked him. "Just let me tell the story. Uninterrupted, all right? I'll lose track otherwise. Just let me ramble about my experience, take your notes, and ask me your dumb little questions after." "Okay," I said, thinking that he probably wasn't getting that extra shot now. He must have thought he was losing my interest because he did not bury the lead. "They killed my grandfather and my daughter," he said. I wrote down grandfather, daughter, and a question mark since I was told not to interrupt him. I would get their names later. "I lost my daughter when she was only 6 years old. I was young at that time, like you. How old are you? 25? 26? He asked. 33, I replied. "Well, I was 27 years old, and I wanted to show her my favorite trail from when I was a kid. The trail my father forbade me to take. I never knew why, it seemed safe enough, though I found it strange how well stamped down it was since I had never seen anyone else out there. The only sign of life before that day that I ever saw was an animal hide hanging from a rope years earlier. It might seem startling to you, but catching game and making rugs and such was more common then, and I thought nothing of it. That day was different. As we walked, we heard noises all around us. It was spring, so I told my daughter that it was just deer and small wildlife moving about." Bob stopped telling the story, and I could see tears forming in the corner of his eyes. He took a minute to compose himself and took another drink of his beer. I decided at that moment that I would get him that extra shot. "It happened so suddenly. I heard a loud noise and then somebody screaming. I looked over towards where the sounds came from, and there was this guy dressed in furs on top of a hill waving his arms at me and making weird noises that were almost musical. Then he smiled at me, which scared me. I turned around from him for 1 second to look at my daughter, but she was gone. And when I looked back, so was he." Tears began to run down Bob's face. I signaled for the bartender and ordered him a second-tier shot of whiskey and another beer. The bartender obliged and said, "I think it's time you paid up and left." "What did I do?" I asked. She tipped her head towards Bob, then signaled for me to move towards the cash register, which I did, but I had no intention of leaving yet. Once away from him, she said, "Don't believe anything that man says to you. Everybody knows that he's the one that killed his daughter. He's just been spinning that tale for the last 40 years, she finished. "Okay, but why do I need to go?" I asked. She turned her head towards the back of the room. The men I had asked questions to earlier were sitting in a corner booth working themselves up. "I've seen this many times before. Once David and Brandon get worked up, there's no calming them down. For my sake, get out of here before it gets out of control. I don't need this today," she said. And then, like on a cue, the two guys got up. I gulped and started making my way to the exit. But they didn't approach me. They went to Bob. I handed my card to the waitress. She rang me up and I quickly signed it. I gave a 30% tip for warning me before I got my butt kicked. This was an expensive day of research. I was glad to get my card back into my wallet before things escalated. "Kid killer!" the bigger one yelled at the old man. "If you weren't so old, I would have kicked your ass long ago." The old man didn't respond. He just took his shot and drank his beer as fast as he could. "What do you have to say, kid killer?" the first guy asked. "To you?" "Nothing," Bob said, and then smashed his glass into the guy's face. The broken glass cut open the man's cheek and eyebrow. Before the second guy could respond, the old man kicked him in the knee as hard as he could. The guy fell and Bob jumped up and ran towards the door. I followed him outside.
Don't go away. Weekly Spooky will be right back.
When I got outside, I saw the old man jump into an old Ford truck. I ran to him wanting to get the rest of the story, but he quickly started it and took off. I waved and tried to stop him. "Where can we meet? I want the rest of the story. What about your grandpa?" The old man stopped just long enough to roll down his manual window and said, "Forget about it. Leave here. You, my friend, are on top of Fool's Hill, heading down the wrong side." Then he drove off. I stood there, stunned until I heard the door of the bar open. "Damn," I muttered to myself, hoping I wasn't going to receive his beating. "Hey, come here," one of the two guys yelled. "Damn it," I muttered to myself as I could hear them walking towards me. Just before they got to me, a plan popped into my head. I turned around and spoke to them, matching their anger. "Where the heck is the closest bar? That kid killer said to meet him there," I lied. They both calmed down, and they told me where the bar was, and we made plans to meet him there and attack the old man. I let them lead and escaped on the first side road I could find. Crisis averted. My next destination was Moran's old farm. I wanted to see if he left any of those trees with the weird carvings up. It was now a nice, well-planned manufactured home with a forest and a large hill as its backdrop. I couldn't find any carvings. Moran either cut them all down for land for his cows to roam, or the developers did. My third and last stop was the land where the Ivanhoes had lived. The property wasn't far off from the former Moran property. It was on the opposite side of the woods in the large hill. The property was mostly vacant except for a small house that was rotting away. There were no signs of any farming or recent habitation on the property. The trees even looked like old growth, like somehow this area was skipped during the lumber boom of the early 20th century. While doing research, I'd never entered an abandoned house before, but this one was a few miles from anywhere, so I felt confident that I wouldn't get caught. Plus, the back door was missing, so it really couldn't be considered breaking and entering, could it? Probably. I'll have to check the laws before publication. Based on the carpet and furniture, no one had lived there since at least the 1970s. It was creepy in the house, but at least it was empty, which meant the chances of getting assaulted by locals were at a lower percentage here. I went through the house quickly as I didn't want to still be out there when it got dark. The first clue that I found in the house was a framed photograph of a family. Looking at it, I could see indents in the picture, like there was writing on the backside. So, I opened up the frame and took the picture out. I was in luck. On the back were the names of the people. I turned on the flashlight on my cell phone and held the photo in front of it. The names were written behind each person in the photo, so holding it up to the light revealed who was who. I was shocked. The names revealed that the young handsome man with the thick 70s-style mustache was Bob Smith. I can't believe that's not an alias. The woman next to him was only listed as Mrs. Smith. The other person in the photo, of course, a young girl, her name was listed as Gracie. Wow. What were the chances that Bob Smith would have lived in this house on the Ivanhoe property? With that, I took out my cell phone and snapped a picture of the front and back of the old photo, then switched to the internet browser so I could bring up the newspaper archives to do some light research. But of course, I was too far out from civilization and didn't get enough of a connection to even load the page. I only had 2 bars. I always wondered, why show any bars if it's not enough to connect or even make a call? Yeah! I heard coming from outside. I walked out but saw nothing. This would have been another good time to leave this path I was taking and head back down Fool's Hill. I listened for a while but heard nothing else, so I went back into the house to look around. Finding nothing else of interest, I made another foolish move and decided to check out the basement. I was only down there for a minute or two before I heard the door close. It was a dugout basement with a dirt floor. While I searched for another way out, I heard multiple footsteps walking through the house. I decided to keep quiet and hope that they would go away. I found no other exit, so all I could do was wait for whoever they were to come down here. The only potential weapon I found was an old 2x4 that was so worm-eaten it would probably break on the first swing. After a while, the sounds of footsteps ceased, so I made moves to escape. To my surprise, the door to the basement was locked, and I had to kick it down. They must have known I was down here. Why they didn't come down and get me, I don't know. Note, it is extremely hard to kick a door open when you're standing on a set of stairs. But I managed. As soon as I started kicking, I heard the screams, "Yeah!" But thankfully, they were in the distance. Once I was out of that house, I ran directly to my car, which of course had 4 flat tires. I still drove it and made it a mile before the tires were so shredded that my rims started throwing sparks from the damage. When I stopped, I could hear that they were following me with their "Yeah!" screams far in the distance. I checked my cell phone. Only 2 bars, so I continued on foot and headed to a place I had been before, that I recalled having a connection. I arrived at the Locust Grove saloon 15 minutes later. I checked my phone. I had full bars. I peeked inside the saloon, and thankfully the 2 brutes from before were not there, and the other bartender's shift must have ended because there was a guy behind the counter now. I thought to myself, I'm okay. While I ate another club sandwich for my dinner and drank another beer, I contemplated my next move. Calling the cops wouldn't accomplish much. What would I say? While I was trespassing, my tires were slashed. I called my insurance to get my car picked up, but they wanted me to meet the driver there, and I had no interest in doing that, at least not tonight. I had just finished my sandwich when Bob Smith walked in. He didn't notice me as he sat down 2 stools over and ordered his drinks. "Hey, Bob," I said. "Still here? I thought you would have gotten yourself killed by now. You are one curious cat, and that curiosity is gonna get you killed," Bob laughed. "You love a good turn of phrase, don't you?" I asked. A nod as he took a sip of his beer was all the response I got. "There's something I don't get. You said they killed your grandpa. When was that?" 1927, years before I was even a gleam in my old man's eyes," Bob said. "Okay, and then your daughter was when?" I asked him. 1977, Bob told me. "That's a 50-year gap. Do you really think it was the same people?" I asked. "Yes," Bob said. "Then who was out there?" I asked. Then I thought about it. "It was you, wasn't it? You followed me out to your old house and locked me in the basement. Why? Just to mess with me?" Bob grabbed his drinks and moved away from me. He gave me a sad little laugh, shook his head, and said, "Mark Twain once said, 'It is better to keep your mouth closed and let people think you are a fool than to open it and remove all doubt.' I knew you were a fool before I even heard you open your mouth," Bob said. I had no comeback, and I was sick of him and his borrowed witticisms. I had thought he was a dumb yokel, but I'm the idiot. I was irritated and had no plan, so I began searching the newspaper archives on my phone for Bob Smith while I thought about my next move. I was too far out for an Uber or a Lyft or even an old-school taxi, and I was still too afraid to go sit in my broken down car. Search for missing girl called off, read the first headline that I found. Subheadline, Mr. Smith's house searched, nothing found. I searched for a while longer but never discovered an article that stated she was ever found. She never was found, alive or dead. Then it hit me. How did Bob never figure it out? A few more searches and I was ready to approach Bob. I sat down next to him. Go away, Bob said. You're a fool, I told him. Yeah, he said and waved his hand at me. I have found references to these people or creatures for over 100 years. Your grandpa was killed nearly 100 years ago, right? Yeah, what are you getting at? Bob asked. You believe they're still out there, right? And you believe they're just people, right? I asked. Yeah, well, the man on the hill looked human to me, Bob said while looking into his drink. How many people have gone missing over the years? I asked. A few. Not a lot, but a noticeable amount, Bob replied. Mostly female, am I correct? Never found? I asked. Bob thought about it hard for a minute. Bodies have been found, mutilated, but those have all been men, Bob said. That is when it clicked in Bob's mind. They're reproducing. It's not the same people who killed his grandpa. Whoever is out there is a couple of generations removed. And they even add new blood to their gene pool from time to time. She's probably one of them, your daughter. She would be what? 52, Bob said, not even having to do the math. We plotted for a while after that, as Bob and I got quite friendly. The conversation ended that night with Bob telling me, well, I guess I got a shotgun. I gave him a questioning look. What did I say to you on our first meeting? Bob asked. That I was on top of Fool's Hill, heading down the other side, I replied. The wrong side. Well, wrong or right, I guess I'm riding shotgun with you on the way down, Bob said. Bob was nice enough to drive me back to my apartment. I did have to give him gas money and $20 for his time. Along the way, we made plans that in a couple of days, we were to head out to his old house and hunt them down, and maybe, just possibly, find his daughter. Over the next couple of days, I got my car towed. I had to buy new tires, of course, but I also had to buy new wheels, since I drove on them like the fool that I am. But I was glad to have those couple of days away from that town because I realized that my curiosity for this story was not as strong as my will to live. So, I made a decision not to pursue it any further. I called Bob to tell him that I was putting on the brakes. I was turning around and heading back up Fool's Hill and back to safety. Except, he didn't answer my call. I left a message and then decided to just stop thinking about it and move on to other things. To Brenda, my niece, if you've read this far, this means I didn't return from my trip. I set up this document to auto-email to you 5 days after I left. That means if you've received this email, I'm probably dead. A few days ago, someone tried to get into my apartment. I believe it's the people from the woods, from that town that I had visited. So that was the last I heard from my uncle. I don't know what he was thinking. He believed there were strange woods people that had been killing locals for over 100 years, and he went out there on his own without a weapon. Why? Because Bob Smith disappeared and someone tried to break into his apartment? There was a simple solution all along. Did you know there really is a Fool's Hill? Yeah, Bob was only being slightly clever when he referenced it. So, this is what happened, and then I'll tell you how I solved this 100-plus-year-old problem. Just like my uncle, I can do research and put two and two together. It's actually a hobby of mine. Other than lurking on web sleuth message boards, I'm also really into those subscription box mysteries. I'm subscribed to a few of them. So, This is what I believe happened using those skills and my conversations with the police. Randy began to get worried since he hadn't heard from Bob Smith in a few days, and he'd heard someone outside his door the night before. He planned to try and figure out where Bob lived, which he was able to do easily enough. Then he packed a bag with supplies and snacks, including a book on witchcraft for whatever reason. These items were found by the police. That's how I know that he brought them. He then drove over to Bob's house. This we know because he left a note on Bob's door. It read, "Hey Bob, if you get this, I've been trying to get a hold of you. Call me. I'm heading to the house." Which he did. He traveled to that house and then most likely entered the woods behind the place. Or they dragged him there. No blood was found around the house, so he probably went of his own accord. Once he entered the woods, he would have started up an incline. Yes, you guessed it. He was heading up the literal Fool's Hill. It was named after this swindler in the 1860s who hid a little gold and a lot of fool's gold around the hill in a scheme to sell the land off to the highest bidder. At some point, they found my uncle's car. It was driven and parked outside of the saloon where he first met Bob. This story would have ended there with my uncle and Bob missing like many others, but like I said, I did some research, found out that Fool's Hill was a real place, then thought, fuck it. I took a chance, lied to the cops, and told them drug manufacturers were operating up on Fool's Hill. The police must have believed me too, because 10 of them headed right up that hill. They found no drugs, but they did find chunks of Bob and my uncle hanging from trees over a burning woodpile. They were smoking the meat to cure it for the winter. The people up there were feral, but were easily taken into custody as they had no real weapons but wooden clubs and old knives they had stolen. They're now all captured and going through the system. There were females in this tribe of lost humanity, but none of them seemed to be the right age to have been Bob's daughter. There's now a new legend out there that Gracie is still in those woods. She's allegedly picking up where the others had left off and is looking to rebuild her family. Or so the legend goes. I love a good mystery unraveling before our very eyes, or in this case, our very ears. Big thanks to Bruce Haney for this week's story. I had a ton of fun with it. And I want to remind everybody that next month, July, we begin our newest Strickfield miniseries. It's called Portals, and here's a little tease of what it's about. A mutant spider girl, a master vampire, a genius, a young girl possessed by the spirit of a white witch, a young girl with the powers of fire and light, and a young guy who's got courage and a bicycle. When these 6 find themselves in an alternate universe where the Earth is a vampire apocalypse, they must become a team and face the overwhelming odds to save their Earth and the many others in the multiverse. It's the biggest Strickfield University team-up to date. All this and the origin of the vampire Earth will be revealed because you demanded it. So, make sure you tune in next Wednesday for part 1 of 5 of the Portals series right here on Weekly Spooky. I also want to say a very special thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay just a little bit more to hear their names on the show, and they are Johnny Nix, Jenny Green, Brent McCullough, Karen Wiemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you so much, and if you want to join the Patreon and make sure the spooky comes every single week, go to weeklyspooky.com, click on Patreon, and select how much you want to give per month. It can be as little as $1 a month, or $15 a month and higher gets your name read on every episode. But now, my friends, it's about time for me to get back to work. There's so much going on and so little time in the week. So for myself, for my executive producers, Rob Fields, Mark Shields, and Bobbletopia.com, our producer, Dan Wilder, and our composer, Ray Mattis, I will talk at you very soon. And get ready for the Portals miniseries starting next week.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to find your way back next week. But for now, you are safe. Trust me,